Hello and welcome back. We are at week 9 now. So, this is the ninth module. In this module, we will talk about the role of nurture. Nurture as in the environmental input that are around the child when the child is growing up. What is the role of those inputs, be it linguistic input, be it socio-cultural input, everything that the child grows up with. How do they influence and whether they influence, how do they influence and so on. So, we will look at various theories within this domain. So, this is a roadmap. The lecture 1 will look at the various scenarios that have been reported in literature with respect to whether the linguistic environment is essential or not. Remember, we talked about behaviorism and constructivism, where we looked at how language learning is outside of the agent. So, inside out or outside in, there are these two kinds of theoretical positions. Inside out is the language faculty is innate. So, all the things that child eventually learns is already there in the innate, as an innate tendency, as an innate property. On the other hand, the outside in theory talks about how the environment adds information to the child's language learning abilities. So, we will look at some instances, some stories, some background information, and in order to give you a broad idea about what kind of evidence we have so far. And in lecture 2 and 3, we will cover the nature of input in terms of linguistic input. Primarily we will talk about the baby talk register, which is also called motherese. So, what kind of baby talk typically surrounds the children, more typically, not always, and then we will also look at certain cases where they do not work, where there are exceptions or they are just different cultural differences and so on. And then the last part, the last 2 lectures will look at the brain in terms of the ecologies. The brain is also developing when the child is developing his or her linguistic abilities. So, these two things go hand in hand simultaneously, as a result of which the development of the brain and its functions also are somewhat connected to the environment. So, how does that impact language learning? This is what we will look at in the last 2 lectures. So, 4 and 5 will focus on ecological brain. So, this is today's lecture. In lecture 1, we are looking at the question as to, is experience necessary? We have some opinions and some stories and some findings to discuss in this segment. So, first and foremost, the role of environment on language development seems almost self evident. This is how it is, otherwise how will they learn? That kind of a commonsensical question often comes to your mind. So, children learn language probably due to the innate capacity. So, the capacity to learn is innate, but what they will learn is dependent on where they are situated. So, where the community they belong to, the language they are surrounded by and so on. So, for example, if dependent upon the environment, they might, if the child is born in an English speaking environment, they might grow up speaking English. Similarly, they can also, the similar probability also exists for a language called Imkyung, which is a Naga language spoken in the northeastern part of India. So, it does not, the innate ability does not decide which language the child will speak. So, that depends on where the child is born. So, the capacity is innate, but the output, which language you will ultimately grow up speaking, that depends on the environment. So, there have been studies that have looked at also the specifiable features of maternal and other caretakers speech on language learning. So, certain kinds of properties of the maternal language, mother's language or any other caregiver's language, there are certain features of the mother's language that may or may have some impact on the children's language learning ability. So, that is another aspect of the environment impacting the child's language. So, this kind of findings, this kind of situations or so say let us say realities typically stress the importance of an expert language user in the environment. So, there has to be somebody who knows the language, some people who speak the language in order for the child to be a master speaker of that language. Also on the other hand, we have the theory of universal grammar. While the theory of universal grammar advocates for a biological programming of language abilities, they do not really say that specific grammars are programmed that way. What is programmed is an innate capacity, an innate underlying universal grammar which is there, but it is not language specific, so to say. So, as a result, even the innateness hypothesis is not exactly against some sort of a environmental input towards helping the child learn language. So, the input of specific language data is needed to interact with the underlying grammar. Similarly, other theories have also underlined the importance of epigenetics and the role of environment. Genetics and epigenetics, that is how we understand them. So, things that are not genetic that are out there in the environment, in the social environment that the child interacts with while growing up, those are called epigenetics. So, role of epigenetics and environment have been stressed by other theories as well. So, similarly, we also have findings that findings from children who are deaf. So, in typically developing children or let us say hearing children, they usually have a babbling phase in the first year of life. That we have already seen when we were tracing the stages of development. So, that is very brief period in the first year of life. However, for deaf children, the oral babbling continues for a very long time, sometimes up to 6 years. So, this was taken as a this is also taken as an evidence that because this happens because they lack a model of language. So, basically there is no input, there is the epigenetic information is not there, the environmental input is not there, that is probably why the this thing happens, this babbling continues for a long time. So, these are some very simple observations and findings that point towards the idea that experience might be necessary. Now, experience or technically we can also call it a model of language, the ambient language, model of the ambient language is essential. So, let us now look at cases where this does not really seem to hold. For example, cases where there language acquisition has happened, but in the face of serious deprivation of various kinds, deprivation as in when the environment did not provide the adequate amount of input for that will help the acquisition of language. So, let us go back a little bit in history. The question as to whether experience is needed to learn language is actually pretty old. The oldest information in this regard that we have is from Herodotus, the Greek historian Herodotus, who in 460 BCE that he mentioned about two kings, one Egyptian king and one Phrygian king, who were having a debate of sorts as to whose language, which language, is it the Egyptian language or the Phrygian language that is the first language, the very first language that came into existence. So, that debate was going on. So, they ordered an experiment. In this experiment, there were two infants who were raised in isolated cabins. They were fed, they were taken care of, but there was no linguistic input. So, they were living in isolation with no other human being around, though they were taken care of, not that they were starved or anything, but unlike Jeannie. So, you must be knowing about the story of Jeannie. We have also referred to her in some cases in terms of critical period hypothesis. This is not that kind of an isolation, but isolated they were. They had no other human contact, no adults were there who were speaking in any language around them. And then as a result there was no language input. So, the experiment as I said was designed to find out. So, they wanted to see, let the children be, they were confined from the very beginning of their life, and they wanted to see when the child starts to speak, they were kind of innatists, in some sense, because they believe that even if they are left on their own, they will speak. So, on the basis of that, they designed this experiment, that whenever the child starts to speak, whatever comes out of his or his mouth will be the language, that is the first language. So, that was the idea. So, apparently the baby started to speak in Phrygian. That's for some time, for some millennia, the debate was kind of settled. Apparently their first words were bekos, which means bread in Phrygian. So, that is the oldest reference we get from history about the ambient language and its role in language understanding or acquiring language. So, these children grew up in isolation, had no linguistic input, still they spoke something which was a particular language in question. Now, we look at some examples that Lenneberg has provided us with. That language learning can also happen in the face of serious pathological conditions. So, he showed that children's early language development can survive radical pathologies. For example, there is a particular problem called anarthria, which is serious inability to articulate speech, even though their auditory and written comprehension are intact. So, even if they understand, they are not able to speak, that is anarthria. Similarly, organic damage to the speech centers of the brain. Even in case of tracheotomy, the children have been found to be able to speak, they have been able to learn language. In the case of tracheotomy is very these kind of things are not very regular. So, this stands out as a very interesting finding. So, the infant in question here, he went through tracheotomy at 6 months of age. Now, this is a medical procedure that is done in order sometimes for various reasons, but typically to help the patient breathe well. So, there is an opening made into the throat and a tube is placed into the trachea through a hole. So, as a result of which they cannot speak. So, this child went through this treatment for 8 months, and however, after this the child's development, linguistic development was recorded immediately after the treatment was over, and from then on his development was tracked, and his development however did not show any major issues with his language abilities. So, which meant that in spite of him being unable to speak, unable to utilize his vocal apparatus for 8 long months starting at 6 months, he still grew up to speak language. So, this made Lenneberg suggest that overt practice of vocalization may not be needed for creating a model of language. That is a theory that when you hear yourself speak alongside hearing others speak, this helps you create a model of the language in your mind. So, that is what he is countering with this evidence, that these children did not, because the articulation was not there. So, similarly for the other kind of patients. So, even in absence of articulation, they could create a model of language. Same kind of idea has been investigated by other researchers as well, that is whether language acquisition can happen without a model. So, there was a study carried out on the home sign. So, this is about this study was carried out on congenitally deaf children. 10 deaf children were studied by this group of researchers. So, they wanted to check that whether home sign will emerge spontaneously. So, a kind of a creative signing. So, this is not the sign language that is formal and that is already existing formalized sign language, that is not home sign. Home sign is what children automatically create on their own when they have no access to any kind of sign language and they are also deaf. So, they have no way to get the speech input from the other hearing and speaking people around them. So, these children they were looking at those children who are not exposed to conventional mode of either spoken or sign language. 10 congenitally deaf children aged between 1.4 to 4.1 years when the recording started, and they were around 2.6 to 5.9 years of age when the final interview happened. They were video recorded in their homes. Now, what they found was, during this time when the recording was going on, when the study was carried out, children started to with pointing. The first thing, the first kind of any kind of communication that they were trying to do, it started with pointing to people and to objects. Now, till here it is normal, it is similar to what other hearing and speaking children will also do. So, they made eye contact and did not point when nobody was looking. This is also fine, because you by now you must be already familiar with the joint attention mechanism. So, they made eye contact and then they pointed out, so that they could initiate joint attention. Now, in hearing children, pointing reduces after a point, because when the speech emerges, they do not need to anymore use pointing, they can then say. So, when they have learned the word for toy, they do not need to point to the toy to get it, they can simply say toy. By just saying the word toy means I want the toy. So, that is what happens with speaking and hearing children. But in this case, what they found was, these children during those very specific timelines, they started to use pointing in combination. So, it is not just one kind of pointing, but they used in a very creative way, they used a combination of pointing, which it was understood to be that they are intended to convey semantic relationship between the references, something like, let us say, pointing to the toy and another ball or something. So, that they want to probably mean that the toy let us say a doll and a ball. So, maybe they want to say that the ball belongs to the doll or something of that sort. So, this is what. So, pointing, combination of pointing, trying to make a connection between, semantic connection between the two reference. And then eventually they also invented, why are we calling it invention? Because they were not familiar, they were not exposed to any kind of formal sign language. So, they had no idea how sign language works. So, whatever is happening with the children is happening organically, automatically, they are doing it spontaneously on their own. Right. So, they also invented motor iconic gestures that seem to specify predicates. So, from pointing they go on to gestures proper. Soon there emerged a combination of points and gestures. Combination of gestures into strings then functioned as meaningful sentences. They started with single gesture, gradually moving to two gesture phrases and then complex sentences, just as a speaking child will do, starting with simple sound followed by words and then two word stage and then some simple sentence and then complex sentences. Exactly the same, in the same way, in the same trajectory, these children were found to invent gestures, combine them with pointing and so on, and thereby they created their own complex language entirely on the basis of the home sign. Thus, home sign showed systematic properties of language development, much like the conventional pattern of language acquisition. Another study on deaf children that comes from Nicaragua, yet another famous study. Now, in this study, in this case, the children are from Nicaragua. So, they were found to use and create their own home sign. Now, Nicaragua did not have a sign language of its own at that time. This study is pretty old, 90s. So, that time they did not have a sign language, and these deaf children, they created their own home sign, and when they came together, when the deaf children came together, and they immediately, I quote, the deaf children started to sign with each other. So, they immediately communicated with each other using the home sign, and they understood each other perfectly well. In fact, this is how Nicaraguan sign language was born. So, this was one of the first documented birth of a natural language. This happened right in front of people's eyes. This was documented and this could be studied. So, this is a case where, another case where there was no exposure to sign language, as well as because they were deaf, they could not also make use of the speech around them. Similarly, another example that has been talked about with respect to lack of having without exposure to the model of language, but still language forms, this the case is of creoles. So, as you all might be aware of, the creoles are created when pidgins start to get native speakers. So, pidgins are what are pidgins? Pidgins are those languages which are typically they are born out of trade situations, where people need to people speak different languages. Due to trade, they have to interact with each other, discuss with each other, but only with respect to that particular activity of trade. So, as a result of which a very limited sort of a language emerges, which is called pidgin. But over a period of time, pidgin also takes into the simplistic nature changes into having complex grammatical systems and so on, and eventually when creoles are spoken by children as native language, as their first language, it tends to get more and more complex, and it takes a life of its own and becomes like a normal any other language. So, this is also given as an example of creoles happen, creoles grow when the native language typically often is not there. So, the creole is a mixture, right. So, even if the lexifier source language is or is not there, the model which the creole will follow is not there. So, as a result of which this also qualifies to be considered that for a language that develops without an explicit model. Similarly, another domain that has been studied at length with respect to this lack of model and use of language and communication is when we look at whether language development and development of communication go hand in hand, because when we learn to speak, we speak to communicate, right. So, they are understood to be going together. If you have learned to speak, you will be also able to communicate, but does it always happen? Apparently, it does not. So, there are some studies that I have quoted here, studies that have revealed that there is there probably sometimes this is possible to have a near total divorce between these two factors of language acquisition, language learning and communication on the other hand. So, one particular case where John, the name given to him is John, aged 3.3 years, had normal language development as per his age, but at the same time his interpersonal communication skills were almost non-existent. So, he hardly communicated with anybody even though his language development was normal, right. So, this was a case of difference between the or let us say non-cooperation between these two skills. So, he refused to talk to other children and teachers. His verbalization was irrelevant to what the parent had just said. So, sometimes he did communicate to his parents, but to friends and teachers he did not. So, there are some examples. So, for example, one occasion his mother said, "Are we going to go and say hi to daddy?" He replied, "Okay, here we are in the garage." So, that kind of a communication skill he had, which is not very useful. So, his communication skill was very poor. This is a study carried out in 1979. Another case was that of Christopher. He was in his 30s when the study was carried out. So, he had a severe case of deficit in non-verbal IQ. He could not find his way around, he could not take care of himself and did not remember numbers, also showed significant visuospatial deficit, serious problem with his non-verbal capacities in various domains. However, his linguistic abilities were exceptional. So, this showed both in the speed with which he learnt new languages and also in his fluency in the languages he knew. So, this is what we just meant by his language abilities were exceptional. So, he could learn language in exceptional speed and also he was rather fluent in all the languages that he knew quite a few languages. So, he could read and write about 15 to 20 languages and showed remarkable ability to translate these languages also. So, he not only spoke translation, just being able to speak one language, let us say your third or fourth language, and being able to translate your those languages to your L1 or L2 or between them or whatever takes a lot of high proficient caliber. He had that as well. This is what we mean by high proficient. So, he showed an attention bordering on obsession with orthographic form of words and their morphological makeup. So, basically he was rather obsessed with language as it is as a tool. So, he not only mastered the languages, but he was also very focused on the structure of it. So, the orthographic form and the morphological makeup and everything. So, he was very much into language. At the same time, he showed an impoverished conversational ability, mostly answered in monosyllables and was reluctant to initiate conversation. So, in spite of such kind of difficulties, his language ability was remarkable. So, that is another case of divorce between the language and the communicative abilities. And then yet another case, that of Clive, demonstrated this kind of dissociation again. So, he is eager to communicate, but has grammatical deficits. For example, he says they mean cold and bath ice in it, they do all the. So, there is no, the sentences are just there is no grammar, nothing to it. So, he was eager to communicate. So, in this is the other way around as opposed to Christopher and John, that they were not able to communicate. This person wants to communicate and tries to communicate, but the language does not quite cooperate. So, his grammatical abilities were deficits. So, this kind of examples show that language acquisition and communication abilities may have separate sources. So, because communication depends on your communication is part of your negotiation with your surroundings. So, this is another kind of domain that proves that the environment and the language abilities may not be entirely together, they may not be entirely dependent on each other. So, the case of John, Christopher and Clive show that there are probably different and independent sources for language and communicative abilities to develop. Now, the another domain is that of perceptual input. So, if you have no perceptual input, perceptual inputs come from environment. If you remember, if all of you must have read about or seen the various films and other things about Helen Keller, how she was touching things, how her teacher put her hands, her fingers under the flowing water to tell her what water is. So, this is how water feels. So, perceptual input comes through your senses, 5 senses, 5 kinds of perceptual input: visual, auditory, tactile and others. So, the idea was to check in these studies whether language can develop without perceptual input. So, the studies here took looked into the blind children. So, one particular experiment here, one particular study here that we report. So, blind child learning fine nuances in word meaning was explored in the study by Landau and Gleitman 1985. They reported that the child's understanding of look and see developed similarly to that of a sighted child. What is happening here is the perception verbs, various kinds of. So, perception as in how you perceive, how your senses perceive a particular thing is dependent on your sensory input. Now, based on that you also have languages have different kinds of vocabulary in that domain. So, most languages, many languages, let us say, not most languages make a distinction between look and see, and you can have even more various kinds of fine grained differences within that. So, just the using your visual apparatus to gain information from the environment can also have graded categories. So, it could be simply a thing like to look, but seeing is different from looking, and then all kinds of other possibilities. So, they wanted to check if this child, because the perceptual input is visual input is not there, is she able to find out the difference between these two kinds of differences, minute difference, very subtle difference. So, when asked to make it so mummy cannot see it, she puts the toy in her pocket. So, this is one example that the study gives. Again, when asked to look behind you, she explored the area behind her with her hands, because that is how they will try to see. Also, her acquisition of reversible pronoun I and you was not later than sighted child, right. So, this kind of findings from the from a blind child was reported, even acquisition of color terms were also reported, which were comparable with the sighted children. So, young children, often the deaf and blind children, can also learn language through what is called vibrotactile information provided to face and neck. This is a particular method of language learning with that is used with deaf and blind children often. This is called the Tadoma method, which is what Helen Keller also is said to have used. So, these cases show that language acquisition can take place without direct perception of the environment. So, then there is yet another domain, even when let us say you are sighted and you are not deaf and mute, you are typically developing child, but then you have the environment is not equal for all children. The environment can be rich as in linguistically rich, it can be culturally rich, or it can be culturally impoverished, it can be linguistically also not very rich, and so on. So, the over the around the world, around various kinds of language communities, the environment in which the children grow up cannot be or need not be or will not be same. So, the environments are variable. So, there is a considerable amount of variation in the rate of language development in children. This variability is seen both in highly enriched environment as well as deprived ones. For example, some studies have looked at orphanage children with limited language input often show developmental delays in many domains, which may include language related domains. However, even though they might have serious deprivation in terms of linguistic and other kinds of input, however, there is a catch up mechanism of some sort that helps them in the later years. So, they counter these kind of effects by a certain kind of mechanism that makes them actually good user of language. So, even if there is a lot of variability in the environment, it need not stop a child from being able to speak properly or learning the nuances of the language in which he or she is born into, or even if they are deaf and mute, they can even create their own sign language and go about it in their own way. So, to sum up, all normal children seem to contain within themselves the ability to create a language regardless of the wide variations of the various kinds of experiences. So, we looked at blind children, we looked at deaf children, we looked at normally developing children as well as various kinds of other studies. All of them seem to point out that irrespective of the environment, the children seem to do fine in terms of until and unless they have some cognitive disorders, they do fine in terms of learning language. So, that again brings us to we are back to square one. Is the environment then useful or not? It seems it is not really very helpful. So, this segment we wrap up here, and this is the end of this lecture. In the next lecture, we will look at some other kinds of input in the experimental domain that have been studied. Thank you.